Hi, I'm the granddaughter my family erased. They said I was a thief, told neighbors I couldn't be trusted, removed my photos from the family albums. At my own grandmother's funeral, my cousin Jessica smirked when I walked through the doors. But then the lawyer opened the will and said my name. The entire room froze. Want to know why? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Because this isn't just about a family feud. It's about how truth finds its way to the surface, no matter how deep it's buried. The lighthouse on the hill still guided ships home, even through the thickest fog. That's how Bayview always felt to me. A beacon calling me back. Even when the path seemed lost. Rain pelted the windshield of my rental car as I drove past the Welcome to Bayview sign, its blue paint fading after years of coastal weather. 3 years since I'd seen these streets. 3 years since I'd been told never to return. The wipers beat a steady rhythm, like the pounding in my chest. I remembered being 8 years old, sitting cross-legged on the worn carpet of Colin's bookstore while Grandma Maggie taught me how to repair old book bindings. "Books are like people, Emma," she'd said, her silver hair catching the afternoon light. "They tell you their stories if you're patient enough to listen." Back then, I thought she was just talking about reading. Now I understood she meant so much more. The Seaside Memorial Chapel appeared through the rain, its white clapboard exterior somehow both welcoming and forbidding. Cars filled the small parking lot. Some I recognized, others belonging to strangers who'd come to pay respects to Margaret Collins, the woman who'd run the town's only bookstore for 45 years. My hands trembled as I parked across the street, far enough away that I could still change my mind. The invitation hadn't come from family. It was Ms. Tanner, my former English teacher, who'd called to tell me about Grandma's passing. She'd "Want you there, Emma," she'd said gently, "no matter what the others think." The others. My mother, Diana, who chose silence over defense when the accusations flew. My cousin Jessica, who'd spent a lifetime coveting what wasn't hers. Uncle Robert, who never met a family drama he couldn't make worse. The thought of facing them made my stomach twist into complicated knots. I stepped out of the car, the rain immediately soaking through my simple black dress. I hadn't brought an umbrella, hadn't planned on coming at all until 3 hours ago. The distance from Westridge to Bayview was only 90 miles, but it had felt like crossing oceans. Inside, the chapel smelled of lilies and damp wool. Hushed voices fell silent as heads turned toward the door. A cousin, Tyler, I think, saw me first, his eyes widening in recognition before quickly looking away. My mother sat in the front row, her back straightening like a rod when someone whispered my name. And then there was Jessica, turning in her seat with practiced precision, her lips curving into that familiar expression that wasn't quite a smile. "You actually came," she said, loud enough for nearby mourners to hear. Her voice carried the same sugary venom I remembered, now matched by an expensive black dress and pearls that looked suspiciously like the ones from Grandma's jewelry box. I didn't speak. What was there to say after 3 years? I moved past the crowded pews to find a seat in the back, where strangers and distant acquaintances sat. Ms. Tanner caught my eye from a middle row and gave a small, encouraging nod. At least one person didn't see me as the villain in this story. The service began with Pastor Williams speaking about legacy and community. "Maggie Collins," he said, "understood that stories connect us. Her bookstore wasn't just a business, it was the heart of Bayview." Several people nodded. A few dabbed at tears. I kept my eyes fixed on the portrait of Grandma beside the closed casket, a photo taken on her 70th birthday, her eyes crinkling at the corners, a book open in her lap. It was easier to look at her image than at the family who'd condemned me. 3 years ago, I'd discovered something while helping Grandma reorganize the storage room above the bookstore. A first edition novel, signed by the author, wrapped carefully, in acid-free paper. It belonged in the glass case with the other valuable books, not hidden in a box of old tax records. When I mentioned it to Grandma, a strange expression crossed her face. "There are things not everyone needs to know about. Emma," she'd said cryptically, "sometimes keeping certain treasures protected means keeping them secret." I didn't understand then what she meant. I just knew that when I returned the next day, the book was back in its hiding place, and Grandma had added a small brass key beside it. The key looked old, its teeth worn with use, but I didn't recognize what it might open. A week later, Jessica visited from her big city job, supposedly to help with inventory. I found her in the storage room, boxes upended, papers scattered across the floor. When she saw me, she snapped something about looking for old photos. I didn't mention the hidden book, but something in her expression made me uneasy. 3 days after that, Grandma called a family meeting. Her face was grave as she announced that several valuable first editions were missing from the store's collection. Her eyes moved around the room, landing on each family member in turn. "If anyone knows anything," she said quietly, "now is the time to speak." The silence stretched, uncomfortable and accusatory. Then Jessica cleared her throat. "I saw Emma taking something from the storage room last week," she said, her voice a perfect blend of reluctance and concern. "I didn't think anything of it at the time, but—" All eyes turned to me. I felt the blood drain from my face. "That's not true," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. Jessica continued, building a careful case of circumstantial evidence. How I'd been asking about the most valuable books in the collection. How I'd been seen carrying packages to my car. How my student loans were coming due, and I was worried about money. One by one, I watched my family's expressions change, from confusion to suspicion. Even my mother looked uncertain. "Emma," Grandma said finally, "is this true?" "No," I insisted. "I would never—" But then Jessica played her trump card. From her purse, she removed a pawn shop receipt with my signature on it. I stared at it in shock, a perfect forgery that I couldn't explain. "I was worried," Jessica said, tears welling in her eyes. "So I checked some local pawn shops. The books are gone, Aunt Maggie." The room exploded. Uncle Robert demanded I empty my apartment. My mother covered her face with her hands. Jessica maintained her devastated expression while casting triumphant glances my way. Only Grandma remained. Emma," she said softly. "Look at me." I did, my vision blurring with unshed tears. "Did you take those books?" "No," I whispered. "I would never betray you." Something flickered in her eyes. Relief, I thought. But before she could speak again, Uncle Robert cut in. "She's lying. The evidence is right there." "I think Emma should leave," Jessica added, "before anything else goes missing." Grandma opened her mouth, perhaps to object, but then clutched suddenly at her chest. Her face paled, and she swayed in her chair. "Grandma?" I moved toward her, but Uncle Robert blocked my path. "You've done enough," he growled. As they called an ambulance, I stood frozen, watching my grandmother being attended to while my family formed a human barrier between us. Jessica gave me one last look, not pretending anymore, just naked satisfaction, before turning back to Grandma. My mother finally approached me, her voice low. "You should go, Emma, at least until things calm down." "You don't believe me either?" I asked, my heart breaking. She couldn't meet my eyes. "I don't know what to believe anymore." That night, I packed whatever would fit in my car and drove to Westridge. No one called to tell me about Grandma's condition. No one called at all. I found a small apartment, took a job at the local library, and tried to rebuild some semblance of a life. Months passed, then years. Occasionally, news of Bayview reached me, the bookstore struggling under Jessica's management, Grandma's health declining, my mother selling the family home and moving to Arizona. I wrote letters to Grandma that I never sent. I dreamed of going back and demanding the truth be heard. But the hurt ran too deep, and my courage faltered. Then Ms. Tanner's call came, and with it, the news that Grandma was gone. Now, sitting in the back pew of Seaside Memorial Chapel, I felt every second of those 3 years pressing down on me. The pastor concluded his remarks, and Jessica rose gracefully to deliver the eulogy. Her voice caught in all the right places, as she spoke of Grandma's devotion to family, those who remained faithful, and her legacy of the beloved bookstore. "Which my grandmother entrusted to me," Jessica added, looking directly at me for the first time since her initial greeting. "To preserve for future generations." I closed my eyes, letting the pain wash over me. Whatever I'd come hoping to find, closure perhaps, or some sense of connection to Grandma one last time, it wasn't here. I was about to slip out when Mr. Wilson, Grandma's longtime attorney, approached the podium. His weathered face scanned the gathering before he adjusted his glasses. "Before we conclude today's service," he said, "Margaret asked that I read a letter she prepared and to distribute certain items according to her wishes." A murmur rippled through the chapel. This wasn't on the program. Jessica frowned from her seat beside my mother, who suddenly... Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He looked uncomfortable. Mr. Wilson unfolded a sealed envelope and began reading in his steady voice. "To my family and friends gathered here, thank you for coming to celebrate a life that was rich with stories, both those I read and those I lived. I've always believed that every story deserves a proper ending, which is why I've asked Herbert to read these words after I'm gone." I leaned forward, drawn by the familiar cadence of Grandma's phrases. 3 years ago, a precious trust was broken in our family. Accusations were made, judgments rendered, and someone very dear to me was cast out without the chance to defend herself properly. The chapel grew so quiet I could hear the rain tapping against the windows. Jessica shifted in her seat, crossing her legs with deliberate casualness. "I knew then what had really happened," Mr. Wilson continued reading, "but a heart attack has a way of interrupting one's plans for justice. By the time I recovered enough to speak clearly, Emma was gone, her number changed, her whereabouts unknown to me. My heart pounded. She had tried to reach me. I'd changed my number to escape the harassing calls from Uncle Robert, never thinking about how Grandma might try to contact me. So I waited, and I watched, and I prepared. Justice may be delayed, but in my story, it will not be denied." Mr. Wilson lowered the letter and reached for a different envelope, this one thicker and sealed with wax. "And now, to the matter of my last will and testament." Jessica straightened, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Uncle Robert leaned forward expectantly. Even my mother seemed suddenly attentive. "The Collins family bookstore, its building, contents and associated intellectual property I leave to my granddaughter, Emma Collins." The words hung in the air like suspended time. I couldn't have heard correctly. A wave of gasps and whispers swept through the chapel. "What?" Jessica's voice cut through the murmurs. "That's not right. We updated the will after..." "After?" What she did. Mr. Wilson looked at her over his glasses. "This will was executed 6 months ago, Jessica. It supersedes all previous versions." Jessica turned to stare at me, her expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. "She can't have..." "The bookstore. She's a thief." "About that," Mr. Wilson continued, unperturbed by her outburst. He pulled another document from his briefcase. "Margaret also left this sworn affidavit explaining that the missing books were never stolen at all, but moved to a secure location on her instructions." She also had a handwriting expert analyze the pawn ticket allegedly signed by Emma. He looked directly at Jessica. It was determined to be a forgery. The chapel erupted. I sat frozen, unable to process what I was hearing. Grandma had known. She had always known I was innocent. Furthermore, Mr. Wilson raised his voice above the commotion. Margaret left a letter specifically for Jessica Collins, which I was instructed to deliver only in the presence of witnesses. He walked across the chapel and handed Jessica a sealed envelope. Her hands trembled as she took it, her composure cracking for the first time. "I suggest you read it privately," Mr. Wilson said, but Jessica was already tearing it open, her eyes scanning the contents frantically. Whatever she read made the color drain from her face. Without a word, she stood and rushed from the chapel. The letter clutched in her hand. The service dissolved into confused conversations. My mother made her way toward me, her expression unreadable. Before she could reach me, Mr. Wilson appeared at my side. "Miss Collins," he said gently. "Your grandmother asked me to give you this." He handed me a small brass key, the same one I'd seen in the storage room 3 years ago. "She said you would know what it opens." I closed my fingers around it, feeling its weight, heavier than its size would suggest. "I don't understand," I said. "What happened to the books? Why didn't she tell everyone the truth?" Mr. Wilson's expression softened. "After her heart attack, your cousin took control of her care very quickly. Limited visitors, monitored calls. By the time Margaret realized what was happening, you were gone, and Jessica had convinced most of the family of her version of events." He hesitated. "Your grandmother was playing a longer game. She wanted not just to clear your name, but to reveal the full truth about Jessica." I looked toward the chapel doors where Jessica had disappeared. "What was in her letter?" "I don't know the contents," he replied, "but I do know it was accompanied by evidence of financial irregularities at the bookstore over the past 3 years. Your grandmother was quite thorough in her record-keeping." The gravity of it all began to sink in. Grandma hadn't just believed me. She'd spent her final years gathering evidence and planning for this moment of revelation. The next morning, I stood outside Collins' bookstore, the brass key cool against my palm. The storefront looked shabbier. Then I remembered. The blue paint fading, the window displays haphazard and dusty. A small sign indicated reduced hours. The heart of Bayview had been ailing in my absence. When I unlocked the door, the familiar scent of old books and lemon polish enveloped me like an embrace. Memories flooded back. Afternoons helping customers find the perfect novel, evenings by the fireplace in the reading nook, Grandma's gentle guidance as she taught me every aspect of the business she loved. "I always knew you'd come back." I turned to find Aunt Sarah, Grandma's oldest friend, emerging from between the stacks. Though not actually related, everyone called her Aunt out of affection. "How did you know I'd be here?" I asked, surprised. She smiled. "Maggie told me to watch for you, said you'd come when it was time." She nodded toward the key in my hand. "That opens her private cabinet in the back office." She was very specific about who was allowed to access it. I followed Aunt Sarah through the familiar maze of bookshelves to the small office behind. The sales counter. The cabinet in question stood in the corner, a beautiful antique secretary desk with a small locked drawer in its center. My hand trembled slightly as I inserted the key. It turned with a satisfying click, and the drawer slid. Open. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, a USB drive, and an envelope with my name written in Grandma's elegant script. I opened the letter first, my eyes filling with tears as I read her words. "My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, I've finally found a way to bring you home. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from the hurt and injustice you suffered. By the time I recovered enough to fight for you, Jessica had taken control of too much. My care, my business, my communication. But she underestimated one thing. a grandmother's patience, and an old woman's ability to appear frail while gathering evidence. The journal contains my observations over the past 3 years. The drive contains financial records and security, footage from the day the books disappeared. Jessica took them herself and sold them to fund the lifestyle I wouldn't finance. The signed confession from the pawnshop owner is in the blue folder. It's all there, Emma. Everything you need to reclaim not just the bookstore, but your place in Bayview. The rest of the family will come around when they see the truth. And if they don't, well, you'll still have the store and the true family. That comes with it. The customers, the community, the stories. You were always meant to continue this legacy. Trust that, as I have always trusted you. All my love, Grandma. Tears flowed freely down my cheeks now. Aunt Sarah placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. She never doubted you, she said softly. Not for a single minute. As I leafed through the journal, the full picture emerged. Jessica's jealousy had festered for years before finding its opportunity. The missing books, the forged pawn ticket, the convenient heart attack that prevented Grandma from immediately setting things right, the calculated takeover of an ailing woman's business and assets. But Grandma had been keeping her own record all along, noting every inconsistency, every suspicious transaction, every small confession Jessica unwittingly made when she thought no one was paying attention. "What will you do now?" Aunt Sarah asked as I closed the journal. I looked around the bookstore, neglected but still beautiful, still filled with stories waiting to be shared. "First, I'm going to clean," I said, managing a small smile. "Then I'm going to restock. And then I'm going to reopen Colin's bookstore the way Grandma intended it to be run." And Jessica? I thought about the cousin who had stolen 3 years of my life, who had tried to steal my grandmother's legacy. "Justice has already found her," I said. "The evidence is overwhelming. She'll have to face the consequences of what she's done." Over the next few weeks, word spread through Bayview. Old customers returned, curious at first, then delighted by the changes. Shelves were reorganized, new inventory arrived, and the reading nook was restored to its former glory. I rehung the sign Grandma had commissioned decades ago. Every story matters. My mother returned from Arizona, tentative at first, guilty over her failure to stand by me. "I should have known," she said, arranging books on a display table. "Mom tried to tell me, but Jessica was so convincing and you were so quiet," I finished for her. "I know. I always thought my silence meant dignity, but sometimes silence just gives space for lies to grow." On the 1-month anniversary of the reopening, Mr. Wilson visited with news. Jessica had agreed to a settlement, returning the proceeds from the sold books and relinquishing any claim to Grandma's estate in exchange for avoiding criminal charges. "Your grandmother would be pleased," he said, looking around at the thriving bookstore. "She always said this place needed someone who understood that running a bookstore wasn't just about selling books, it was about keeping stories alive." That evening, after closing, I sat in Grandma's old chair by the fireplace, a first edition of her favorite novel open in my lap. The brass key hung on a chain around my neck now, not because I needed it anymore, but because it reminded me of what had been locked away and what had been unlocked. The bell above the door chimed softly, though I was sure I'd locked up. "We're closed," I called without looking up. "Even for old friends?" came a familiar voice. Ms. Tanner stood in the doorway, a gentle smile on her face. "I thought you might like some company on your first month back." She joined me by the fire, and we talked about Grandma, about books, about the strange journey that had brought me back to Bayview. "You know," Ms. Tanner said thoughtfully, "Maggie once told me that the best stories aren't about the battles we fight, but about coming home after the battle, changed but intact." I glanced around the bookstore, at the shelves my grandmother had filled, at the community she'd built, at the legacy she'd protected for me until I could reclaim it. "I think she was right," I said softly. I'm still finding my way home. In the quiet of the evening, with the rain tapping gently against the windows and the scent of old books surrounding me, I felt Grandma's presence. Not in some mystical way, but in the foundations of the place she'd created and entrusted to me, in the margins of books she'd annotated, in the wisdom she'd left behind. Jessica had taken 3 years of my life, but Grandma had given me something far more valuable, the truth, and a place to belong again. Some people say revenge is a dish best served cold, but I've learned that justice served with grace is far more satisfying. The bookstore flourishes now, not because I wanted to prove Jessica wrong, but because I wanted to prove Grandma right, about me, about stories, about the power of patience and truth. Every morning when I unlock the front door, I whisper a small, "Thank you to the woman who never stopped believing in me, who found a way to speak the truth even after she was gone." And in that moment, I feel like the protagonist in one of the stories she loved so much, changed by hardship, but ultimately victorious. Because in the end, that's what Grandma taught me. We don't get to choose all the chapters in our story, but we do get to decide how we respond when the plot takes an unexpected turn. And sometimes, if we're patient enough, we get to write our own ending. The hardest part about returning to Colin's bookstore wasn't facing the dusty shelves or neglected inventory. It was walking past the community bulletin board where Grandma, Maggie, had proudly displayed my college acceptance letter years ago. Now it held outdated flyers and Jessica's business cards with "manager" printed in bold letters beneath her name. I pulled them down one by one, each removal like lifting a small weight from my chest. "They didn't come here much anyway," said a voice behind me. I turned to find Mrs. Henderson, the retired high school librarian who'd spent every Wednesday afternoon in the poetry corner for as long as I could remember. Her silver hair was gathered in the same neat bun, though perhaps with more strands escaping than before. "Who didn't?" I asked, tucking Jessica's cards into my pocket rather than dropping them in the trash where I wanted them. "The family," she clarified, running a finger along a dusty shelf and frowning at the result. "Your cousin would breeze in for an hour or two, check the register, and leave. Your Uncle Robert stopped by only to collect monthly reports. The heart went out of this place when you left, dear." I swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in my throat. I didn't leave by choice. Mrs. Henderson's eyes softened. "We knew that. At least those of us who'd watched you grow up here did. The way that girl spun the story." She shook her head disapprovingly. "But your grandmother never believed it. Not for a minute." "Then why didn't she defend me?" The question escaped, before I could stop it, carrying 3 years of hurt. Mrs. Henderson placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Oh, Emma," she tried. But after her heart attack, things happened so quickly. Jessica made herself indispensable to Maggie's recovery, positioned herself between your grandmother and anyone who might contradict her version of events. She sighed. "By the time any of us realized what was happening, you were gone, and Maggie was too frail to fight the narrative Jessica had created." I turned back to the bulletin board, pinning up a fresh calendar and a notice about the bookstore's grand reopening. "I've been thinking about that day a lot," I said quietly. "The family meeting, the accusations, Grandma collapsing, it all happened so fast." "Almost like it was planned," Mrs. Henderson suggested, her voice dropping to match mine. I glanced at her sharply. "What do you mean?" She looked around the empty store before continuing. "I don't like to speak ill of people, Emma, but that heart attack came at a very convenient moment for your cousin. Just when Maggie seemed about to question her story more deeply." The memory of that day resurfaced with new clarity. Grandma asking me to look her in the eyes, the flicker of understanding in her expression, her mouth opening to speak, and then the sudden clutch at her chest, the color draining from her face. "You think Jessica somehow caused Grandma's heart attack?" The suggestion seemed outlandish, yet a cold feeling settled in my stomach. Mrs. Henderson shook her head. I wouldn't go that far. But stress can trigger these things, and your cousin certainly knew how to create tension. The timing was fortunate for her narrative. Before I could respond, the bell above the door jingled. A young woman entered, pushing a stroller with a sleeping toddler inside. "Hello?" she called hesitantly. "Are you open?" The sign says closed, but I saw movement inside. "We're just preparing for our reopening next week," I explained, moving toward her. "But you're welcome to browse if there's something specific you're looking for." Her face brightened. "You must be Emma. I'm Lily. Your grandmother used to special order books for me before." She gestured vaguely. "Before things changed." "Lily Parker," Mrs. Henderson supplied. "She married David from the hardware store and had little Sophie here about 2 years ago." Lily smiled at the introduction. "Your grandmother kept a shelf of children's books behind the counter for Sophie whenever we visited." Jessica packed them away, said they took up valuable display space for bestsellers. That sounded exactly like Jessica's approach, prioritizing quick sales over community connection. It was everything Grandma had resisted during her decades running the store. "What kind of books did Sophie like?" I asked, already moving toward the storage room where I'd noticed boxes of children's literature stacked haphazardly. "Anything." "With animals?" Lily replied, her voice warming. "Especially otters. Maggie found this rare picture book about a river otter family that Sophie absolutely adored." 20 minutes later, Sophie was awake and sitting on the reading rug, entranced by the very book Lily had described. I'd found it tucked away in a box labeled Discontinued Inventory, Jessica's designation for items that built community, but perhaps not immediate profit. "She kept everything," I murmured, watching Sophie carefully turn the colorful pages. "Even when they told her to get rid of it." "That was Maggie," Mrs. Henderson agreed. "She knew what mattered." After Lily and Sophie left, promising to return, for the grand reopening, I continued sorting through the storage room. Years of my grandmother's careful organization had been dismantled in my absence. Boxes were mislabeled, inventory records incomplete, special orders abandoned. In the corner, furthest from the door, I found a crate marked Personal Effects, Discard. Inside were framed photos from the store's history, including the grand opening day in 1973 when my grandparents had first unlocked the doors. There was a shot of my mother as a teenager, shelving books beside her father. And buried at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, a framed photograph of me at 16, accepting a Young Writers Award with Grandma Maggie beaming proudly beside me. Jessica hadn't just taken over the store. She'd systematically erased its history, our family's history, replacing it with her version. The realization settled like a stone in my stomach. This wasn't just about the valuable books she'd stolen or the inheritance she'd tried to secure. It was about rewriting our family's story with herself as the protagonist. The bell jingled again. This time, it was Mr. Wilson, carrying a leather portfolio. "I thought I might find you here," he said, looking around at the disarray of the storage room. "Making progress?" I gestured at the chaos surrounding me. "It's worse than I imagined. She's practically gutted the place." He nodded solemnly. "I'm afraid there's more. I've been reviewing the financial records your grandmother compiled. It appears Jessica has been systematically siphoning funds from the business accounts for years." "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that we should discuss your options." He patted the portfolio. "But not here. The walls in Bayview have always had ears." We arranged to meet at his office later that afternoon. As he turned to leave, he paused in the doorway. "Emma, there's something else you should know. Your grandmother suspected that Jessica might try to contest the will. She was quite insistent that I tell you about something called the Lighthouse collection. Does that mean anything to you?" A memory surfaced, Grandma Maggie pointing out the lighthouse on the hill from the store's upstairs window. "Everyone focuses on the beacon," she'd said, "but the real treasure is in the keeper's quarters." "I think I know what she meant," I told Mr. Wilson. "Thank you." After he left, I climbed the narrow stairs to the apartment above the bookstore where my grandparents had lived until Grandpa died. Grandma had moved to the house on Lighthouse Hill after that, unable to sleep in their shared bedroom, but unwilling to sell the building that housed her beloved store. The apartment was dusty, but surprisingly untouched. Unlike the bookstore below, Jessica hadn't bothered to remake this space in her image. Perhaps it held too many genuine family memories that couldn't be easily erased. I crossed to the bay window that overlooked the harbor. From here, you could see the lighthouse standing sentinel on the hill, its white tower gleaming against the blue sky. Grandma's house, my house now, sat just below it, partially obscured by pine trees. "The keeper's quarters," I murmured, mentally, mapping the layout of the hillside property. There was the main house, the detached garage, and a small garden shed. None of them resembled traditional lighthouse keeper's quarters. Unless... I hurried back downstairs, locking the bookstore. Behind me, my rental car was still parked out front, but instead of driving, I walked briskly through town toward Lighthouse Hill. The exercise helped clear my head as I pieced together Grandma's clues. The house came into view as I rounded the curve of Harbor Street. It was a classic New England salt box, painted a soft gray with white trim, its garden overgrown after months of neglect. But it wasn't the main house that drew my attention now. It was the small outbuilding tucked behind it, almost invisible from the road. When I was a child, we'd called it the Playhouse. It was built to resemble a miniature lighthouse keeper's cottage, complete with a tiny cupola. Grandpa had constructed it for my mother decades ago, and later it had become my special retreat. The path to it was nearly hidden by untrimmed hydrangeas, but muscle memory guided my feet. The small door was locked, but the key had always been kept under a particular rock beside the step. It was still there, tarnished but functional. Inside, the playhouse was exactly as I remembered. A single room with a child-sized table and chairs, bookshelves lining one wall, a window seat overlooking the ocean. Dust motes danced in the sunbeam that slanted through the east-facing window. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. The books on the shelves were the same ones I'd read as a child. The cushions on the window seat were faded but intact. The tiny desk held dried-up markers and sheets of yellowed drawing paper. I stood in the center of the room, turning slowly. What had Grandma wanted me to find here? The answer came when my eyes fell on the old sea chest tucked beneath the window seat. It had always been part of the playhouse's decor, supposedly a genuine artifact from a shipwrecked vessel. As children, we'd used it as a pirate's treasure chest in our games. I knelt and lifted the heavy wooden lid. Inside, instead of the fabric scraps and costume jewelry I expected, were books. Not children's books, but carefully wrapped volumes that I recognized immediately. The missing first editions that had been the center of the accusations against me. Nestled among them was a leather journal embossed with Grandma's initials and a sealed envelope with my name written in her handwriting. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. "My dearest Emma," the letter began, "if you're reading this, you've solved my first clue, and you're now where Jessica would never think to look, a place too full of genuine family history to interest her. The books you were accused of stealing have been here all along, safe from Jessica's greed. I moved them the night before our family meeting, after finding her in the storage room searching through my private papers. I intended to tell you immediately, but events unfolded too quickly. By the time I recovered from my heart attack, Jessica had woven her web too tightly around me, limiting my visitors and monitoring my calls. She told the family you'd left town without a word, suggesting it proved your guilt. When I finally learned the full extent of her lies, you were gone without a trace. So I began to gather evidence quietly. The journal contains everything: dates, transactions, conversations overheard. The USB drive holds scanned documents and recordings. Together, they tell the truth about what Jessica has done to you, to me, and to our family legacy. There is one more thing you should know. The heart attack that day wasn't entirely natural. The doctor found traces of a substance that, while not lethal, could induce symptoms similar to cardiac distress. I never told Jessica about this discovery, letting her believe she'd succeeded. Sometimes, Emma, being underestimated is our greatest advantage. All my love, Grandma Maggie. I sat back on my heels, the letter clutched in my hand, my mind reeling. Jessica hadn't just opportunistically used Grandma's collapse to her advantage. She'd deliberately caused it to stop Grandma from defending me. The cold calculation of it stole my breath. The journal contained exactly what Grandma had promised: meticulous records of Jessica's actions over the past 3 years. Funds diverted from the bookstore to personal accounts. Valuable inventory, sold through private dealers. Even recordings of phone conversations where Jessica bragged to friends about how easily she'd manipulated the situation. Most disturbing were the entries detailing how Jessica had systematically isolated Grandma from anyone who might question her version of events. Medication accidentally administered at incorrect times before important visits. Phone calls screened, and messages intercepted. A carefully constructed narrative of concern for an elderly woman's well-being that actually served to keep her captive. I gathered everything and secured it in my backpack, then carefully relocked the playhouse. The sun was lowering toward the horizon as I made my way to Mr. Wilson's office, the weight of Grandma's evidence heavy against my back. His office was in a converted Victorian on Maple Street, the brass plaque beside the door reading, Wilson. And associates, attorneys at law, though everyone in town knew Mr. Wilson worked alone. His secretary, Mrs. Finch, had been with him for over 40 years and guarded his schedule with fierce dedication. She looked up as I entered, recognition softening her usually stern expression. "Emma Collins, it's about time you came back." She buzzed me in without waiting for a response. Mr. Wilson sat behind a desk crowded with legal texts and manila folders, his reading glasses perched precariously on the end of his nose. He gestured to the chair opposite him. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he observed as I sank into the seat. "Not a ghost," I replied, unzipping my backpack. "Just the truth." I placed Grandma's journal and letter on his desk. Jessica didn't just steal from the bookstore. She deliberately caused Grandma's heart attack to prevent her from defending me. His eyebrows rose as he scanned the letter, then lifted even higher as he flipped through the journal. "This is extremely troubling," he said finally, removing his glasses to polish them with his handkerchief, a gesture I recognized as his way of buying time to think. "Troubling?" I echoed. "It's criminal. She drugged my grandmother, stole from the business, and framed me for theft. She manipulated our entire family with calculated lies." "Yes," he agreed, replacing his glasses. "And proving all of that would require a lengthy legal battle that would drain the store's remaining resources and potentially tear your family apart permanently." He held up a hand as I started to protest. "I'm not suggesting we ignore this, Emma. I'm suggesting we be strategic about how we use this information." Mr. Wilson spread several documents from his portfolio across the desk. "Your grandmother anticipated something like this. She structured her will and the transfer of the bookstore in a way that would be virtually impossible for Jessica to contest successfully. But there's also this." He slid a sealed envelope toward me, thicker than the one I'd found in the playhouse, with "In the event of contested inheritance," written on the front in Grandma's handwriting. "Maggie instructed me to open this only if Jessica took legal action against you or the will," he explained. "Inside is evidence that she intended to take directly to the police if necessary. Evidence of financial fraud that goes beyond the bookstore." Apparently, Jessica has been running a similar scheme with other elderly relatives in her father's family. I stared at the envelope, understanding dawning. So, Grandma was giving Jessica a choice: accept the will and walk away, or fight it and face criminal charges. Mr. Wilson nodded. Exactly. And knowing Jessica's instinct for self-preservation, she'll take the escape route, I finished, but that means she gets away with what she did to me, to Grandma, to the store. Not entirely. He pulled another document from the stack. This is the settlement agreement your grandmother drafted. It requires Jessica to repay all misappropriated funds to the bookstore, sign a full confession regarding the false accusations against you, which will remain sealed unless she violates the agreement, and relinquish any future claims to Collins' family assets. I read through the document, marveling at Grandma's foresight. She'd known exactly how Jessica would respond and had prepared accordingly. Not a perfect justice, perhaps, but a practical one that protected what mattered most: the bookstore's future and my reputation. There's one more thing, Mr. Wilson added, his expression softening. Maggie left a video message for you. She asked that I play it for you once everything was settled. He turned his computer monitor toward me and pressed play. Grandma's face filled the screen, thinner than I remembered, her silver hair neatly combed, her blue eyes still sharp despite the illness that had weakened her body. She sat in her favorite chair by the window of her bedroom, sunlight casting a warm glow around her. Emma, my darling girl, she began, her voice steady despite the oxygen tube visible beneath her nose. If you're watching this, then Herbert has explained everything, and you're back where you belong. I'm so sorry for what you've endured. The thought of you out there alone, believing I'd turned against you, has been the greatest sorrow of my final years. Tears blurred my vision as she continued. I want you to know that I never doubted you, not for a single moment. When Jessica began her campaign, I recognized the jealousy that had always driven her, but I underestimated how far she would go. By the time I realized the full extent of her plan, she'd already isolated me from everyone who might have helped me reach you. But we Collins women are nothing if not patient, so I gathered evidence, made preparations, and waited for the right moment. The bookstore has always been meant for you, Emma. You understand what it truly is. Not just a business, but a keeper of stories, a heart for our community, a place where people find themselves in the pages of books. I know you're angry, hurt, and looking for justice. But remember what I taught you about the best stories. They're never about revenge, but about restoration, about finding what was lost and making it whole again. Don't let bitterness define your next chapter, my dear. Let it be about rebuilding, reconnecting, rediscovering joy. The bookstore is yours now. The house on Lighthouse Hill, too. Fill them both with light and stories and people who recognize your worth. And when you look out at the lighthouse, remember that even in the darkest storm, the keeper's job isn't to calm the sea, but to shine anyway. I love you, my Emma. I always have, and somewhere beyond this life, I always will. The video ended, freezing on Grandma's gentle smile. I sat silently, tears streaming down my face, overwhelmed by grief and love and vindication all at once. Mr. Wilson discreetly pushed a box of tissues toward me, then busied himself reorganizing papers to give me a moment to compose myself. She knew, I said finally, wiping my eyes. All this time, she knew the truth and was fighting for me in her own way. Maggie Collins was the most formidable person I've ever represented, Mr. Wilson said with quiet admiration, and the most strategic. She ensured that no matter what happened, you would have everything you needed to reclaim your place here, legally, financially, and emotionally. As I walked back to the bookstore that evening, the setting sun painted Bayview in shades of gold and amber. Familiar storefronts took on a dreamlike quality in the fading light. 3 years of exile had changed how I saw this place. No longer just the town where I'd grown up. but a community I'd fought to return to. A legacy I'd inherited not just through legal documents but through Grandma's trust and belief in me. The bookstore windows reflected the sunset as I approached, the silhouette of emptied shelves waiting to be filled again. Tomorrow would bring meetings with suppliers, calls to publishers, conversations with potential employees. The practical work of resurrection. But tonight, in the quiet of the closed store, I sat at Grandma's old desk with her journal open before me, surrounded by the ghosts of stories past and the promise of stories yet to come. The path forward wasn't about proving Jessica wrong anymore. It was about proving Grandma right, about the bookstore, about Bayview, about me. I opened the bottom drawer where Grandma had always kept her special inventory, the books she considered treasures rather than merchandise. Inside was a single volume, a leather-bound collection of lighthouse stories with a bookmark placed deliberately. Between the pages, the passage she'd marked read, "The lighthouse keeper's most important quality isn't vigilance or strength, but faith. Faith that their light matters, even when they cannot see the ships it guides safely home." I closed the book and held it to my chest, feeling Grandma's presence in the quiet creaks of the old building, in the lingering scent of paper and possibility, in the legacy she'd preserved for me against all odds. Tomorrow, Collins Bookstore would begin its next chapter, and I would be both its author and its keeper, bearing witness to the power of patience, truth, and a love strong enough to outlast even the most carefully constructed lies. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept across the darkening bay, steady and sure, guiding the way home. The morning of Collins Bookstore's grand reopening dawned bright and clear, as if even the notoriously fickle Bayview weather was celebrating our triumph. I stood on the sidewalk before the freshly painted storefront, keys in hand, watching the sunrise glint off the new gold lettering on the window. Collins Bookstore, Esther 1973, every story matters. The past 2 weeks had transformed the space. With help from volunteers, mostly longtime customers who appeared with paintbrushes and determination after word spread of my return, we'd restored the worn oak shelves to their original luster, reorganized the scattered inventory, and recreated the reading nook with its comfortable chairs and soft lighting. The children's corner now featured a hand-painted mural of lighthouse scenes and sea creatures, courtesy of the high school art teacher, who remembered how Grandma Maggie had supplied materials for her classroom every September. But beyond the physical restoration, something more profound had happened. As we worked, stories flowed. Memories of book club meetings held after hours, of Grandma tracking down rare editions for special occasions, of quiet kindnesses extended to customers going through hard times. The bookstore had been more than a business. It had been the thread that wove our community together, and its unraveling under Jessica's management had left a gap that everyone felt. "Quite the transformation," said a voice behind me. I turned to find Mr. Wilson, looking unusually casual in a sweater rather than his standard suit. He carried 2 coffee cups from the Harbor Cafe and offered one to me. "It looks like it always should have," I replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. The aroma of cinnamon and nutmeg wafted up from the cup. "How did you know my order?" "Maggie told me," he said with a small smile. "She made a list of things I should remember about you. Your coffee preference was item number 3, right after your birthday and your allergy to shellfish." The revelation shouldn't have surprised me. Grandma's thoroughness was legendary, but the thought of her preparing such details while planning for a future she wouldn't see brought a fresh ache to my heart. "Did she also tell you I'd be here at dawn, or was that a lucky guess?" I asked, sipping the perfectly spiced coffee. "That was item number 17. Emma rises with the sun when she's nervous." His eyes crinkled with gentle humor. "Are you? Nervous, I mean." I considered the question, watching a seagull soar overhead. "Not about the store. This feels right, like coming home. But the town meeting tonight." I trailed off, uncertain how to express my apprehension. The town council had called a special session to discuss the future of historic business properties in Bayview, which everyone knew was code for addressing the Collins bookstore situation. Jessica had apparently been laying groundwork during my absence, lobbying for zoning changes that would allow the building to be repurposed for more economically beneficial uses. Her plans had stalled after Grandma's will was read, but her allies on the council hadn't abandoned the fight. "You've prepared well," Mr. Wilson assured me. "The financial projections are sound, the community support is evident, and most importantly, you have the truth on your side." "Truth doesn't always win in town politics," I reminded him, thinking of past council debates I'd witnessed where connections outweighed facts. "Perhaps not," he conceded, "but it has a powerful ally in public opinion, and Jessica has squandered that particular currency." He wasn't wrong. In the days following the funeral, Jessica's carefully constructed facade had begun to crumble. First came the rumors about the bookstore's financial irregularities, then whispers about Grandma's care being unnecessarily restricted. When Jessica abruptly left town for a business opportunity, her hastily packed bags and midnight departure only confirmed suspicions. "Speaking of our absent cousin," Mr. Wilson continued, "I received a response to our settlement offer late yesterday." My grip tightened on the coffee cup, and she's accepted the terms, with one additional request, that we provide written assurance the sealed confession will remain private unless she violates the agreement. I frowned. "So she gets to preserve her reputation while admitting to what she did?" "Only outwardly," he clarified. "The terms explicitly prohibit her from making any statements contradicting the truth about your innocence. She simply avoids public prosecution." "Which means she avoids jail," I said flatly. Mr. Wilson sighed. "Emma, seeking criminal charges would mean months, possibly years of legal battles. Your grandmother's approach offers something valuable. In exchange, immediate closure and the freedom to move forward without Jessica's shadow hanging over you." I gazed at the bookstore, considering his words. The building stood solid and patient, just as it had when I was a child learning to alphabetize inventory cards at Grandma's side. It had weathered storms, both literal and figurative, and now it waited for its next chapter to begin. "All right," I said finally. "I'll sign off on it. Not for her sake, but for the store's, and for Grandma's." His expression softened. "She would be proud of your decision." The first customers arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, led by Mrs. Henderson, who declared she wouldn't miss the resurrection of Bayview's heart for anything. Behind her came a steady stream of familiar faces, teachers from the local schools, fishermen still in their work clothes, young mothers with children in tow. By noon, the store hummed with conversations and the gentle rustle of turning pages. Lily and Sophie claimed the renovated children's corner, the toddler's delighted squeals when she discovered the otter books we'd ordered specially for her drawing smiles from everyone nearby. The high school English teacher inquired about hosting her poetry club's monthly meetings in our space again. An elderly man I'd never met approached the register with tears in his eyes, explaining that he and his late wife had spent every anniversary browsing our shelves together. "Jessica told me the tradition was disrupting business," he said, his voice quavering. "Asked me not to linger so long last year." I reached across the counter to squeeze his hand. "Stay as long as you like, Mr. Cooper," he supplied. "Harold Cooper. Your grandmother always saved Helen's favorite mystery authors for us." "Then we'll do the same," I promised. "In fact, we've just received the latest from that British author she loved." The smile that transformed his face was worth more than any sales target Jessica might have prioritized. By closing time, the cash register showed modest but encouraging figures, and the special order book contained dozens of requests. More importantly, the store felt alive again. Shelves slightly disheveled from curious hands, the reading chairs, arranged in conversational clusters, coffee cups from the newly installed service station creating rings on the side tables despite the coasters provided. As I locked the front door, flipping the open sign to closed, a sense of rightness settled over me. This was what Grandma had fought to preserve. Not just a retail space, but a sanctuary where stories connected people to each other and to themselves. I had barely an hour before the town meeting. After quickly freshening up in the apartment, upstairs I gathered the presentation materials Mr. Wilson had helped me prepare. Financial projections, community impact statements, historical significance documentation, all carefully organized to counter whatever arguments Jessica's allies might raise. The town hall stood at the center of Bayview, its white columns and cupola visible from nearly every street. Built in the late 1800s, it had witnessed generations of community decisions, from Revolutionary War commemorations to modern zoning disputes. Tonight, it would hear the case for preserving a legacy Grandma had spent her life building. The meeting room was already crowded when I arrived. The 5 council members sat at their elevated table, expressions ranging from warmly welcoming — Mayor Thompson had been a regular at Grandma's book clubs — to coolly assessing — Councilman Baxter had reportedly invested in Jessica's alternative plans for the property. The audience seating was filled with faces I'd seen throughout the day at the bookstore, along with others I recognized as local business owners and community leaders. Mr. Wilson motioned me toward a saved seat near the front, beside Aunt Sarah, who had brought a thick folder of her own notes. "Ammunition," she whispered, patting the folder. "Just in case." Mayor Thompson called the meeting to order with 3 sharp taps of her gavel. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's special session will address Agenda Item 1, the future development, status of historic commercial properties in Bayview's downtown district, with specific focus on the Collins bookstore property at 143 Harbor Street." Councilman Baxter immediately leaned toward his microphone. "Madam Mayor, I'd like to begin by addressing the economic implications of maintaining outdated business models in prime commercial locations." His presentation was slick and rehearsed, complete with charts showing declining book sales nationally and projected tax revenue increases if the property were reimagined as a multi-use development. Though he carefully avoided naming Jessica directly, her influence permeated every point, the same arguments she'd been making for years about the bookstore being a charming but unprofitable relic. "In conclusion," he finished 20 minutes later, "while we respect tradition, Bayview must evolve to remain economically viable. The Collins property represents our best opportunity to demonstrate forward-thinking development." A smattering of applause followed, mostly from a group seated together near the back. Local developers and their associates, I guessed. Mayor Thompson nodded politely. "Thank you, Councilman. Now, as the current legal owner of the property in question is present, I believe it's appropriate that Ms. Emma Collins be given equal time to respond." My heart pounded as I approached the podium, acutely aware of every eye in the room following my progress. The folder felt suddenly inadequate. In my hands, the carefully prepared statements too formal for what needed to be said. "Thank you, Madam Mayor, council members," I began, setting the folder aside unopened. I had a detailed presentation prepared, with projections and statistics and historical documentation. But sitting here tonight, listening to discussions about property and development opportunities, I realized we're having the wrong conversation entirely. I paused, gathering my thoughts as a murmur rippled through the audience. The Collins bookstore isn't just a business occupying valuable real estate. It's the place where 3 generations of Bayview children discovered the joy of reading. It's where the volunteer fire department held fundraisers after the harbor flood of '97. It's where our high school students find quiet corners to study when home is too chaotic. My voice strengthened as I continued, memories flowing into words. When Mrs. Martinez lost her husband last year, it's where she found books on grief that she couldn't afford to buy, books my grandmother insisted she take home without payment. When the elementary school's library budget was cut, it's where teachers found donated materials to fill the gaps. When Mr. Cooper needed a connection to his late wife's memory, it's where he came to feel close to her again. I looked directly at Councilman Baxter. You can't measure these things on economic projection charts. You can't calculate the value of a community space in property tax increases. From my bag, I withdrew Grandma's journal, not the one detailing Jessica's deceptions, but an older volume I'd found in the store's archives, chronicling 4 decades of the bookstore's history. My grandmother kept records of more than inventory and sales. She documented the life of this town through the books that shaped it. I opened to a marked page. This entry from 1985 notes that young Danny Harris, who struggled with reading, finally found his way through a book about shipbuilding. That Danny Harris is now our harbor master, overseeing the Marina Development Councilman Baxter praised in his own presentation. Danny, seated midway through the audience, nodded with a reminiscent smile. Other heads turned toward him, connecting. The successful man of today with the struggling boy of yesterday. There are hundreds of stories like this. People whose lives were changed, not by a building or a business, but by a place that put what they needed above profit margins. I closed the journal gently. That's the legacy I've inherited. Not just property, but purpose. I turned to address the wider audience directly. I've spent the past 2 weeks speaking with our distributors, updating our systems, and developing a sustainable business model that honors tradition while embracing change. We're expanding our online presence, partnering with local schools, and creating a community publishing program to preserve Bayview's stories. Returning my attention to the council members, I concluded, the question isn't whether an old bookstore should make way for new development. The question is whether Bayview still values spaces where commerce and community merge, where we're more than consumers, but neighbors sharing in something meaningful. I believe we do, and I'm asking for the chance to prove it. As I returned to my seat, the silence gave way to applause, not polite or scattered, but genuine and building. Mayor Thompson allowed it to continue longer than protocol might dictate, her own hands joining the ovation. When order was restored, Councilwoman Rivera, who had remained silent until now, addressed her colleagues. I move that we table any zoning reconsideration for the Collins property for a minimum of 2 years, allowing the new management to implement their business plan with quarterly progress reviews. Seconded, added Councilman Jeffries immediately. The vote was 4-1, with only Councilman Baxter dissenting. As the gavel fell to confirm the decision, a weight seemed to lift from the room. Conversations erupted, people gathered in animated groups, and several approached me with congratulations and offers of support. Through it all, I felt Grandma's presence, not as grief or loss, but as continuity. She had preserved more than books. She had safeguarded a vision of community that resonated still. As the crowd thinned, Mayor Thompson made her way to where Mr. Wilson and I were gathering our materials. That was quite a testimony, she said warmly. Maggie would be proud. Thank you, I replied. I'm just trying to honor what she built. Well, you've made a powerful start. She hesitated, glancing around to ensure we weren't overheard. I should mention that Jessica called me yesterday. My stomach tightened. What did she want? To withdraw her previous proposals and sever her connections with the development group, the mayor said, watching my reaction carefully. She was quite insistent that I know she no longer had any interest in the Collins property, financially or otherwise. Mr. Wilson and I exchanged glances. The settlement agreement had been formally executed that morning, Jessica relinquishing claims to any Collins assets in exchange for avoiding prosecution. Her call to the mayor suggested she was wasting no time in distancing herself from her previous schemes. Did she mention when she might return to Bayview? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Mayor Thompson's expression turned dry. She indicated her new opportunities would keep her away indefinitely. Between us, I don't think we'll be seeing much of Jessica Collins in the foreseeable future. After the mayor moved on, Mr. Wilson placed a supportive hand on my shoulder. A clean break is probably best for everyone concerned. I nodded, though the resolution felt curiously hollow. After years of anger and months of vindication seeking, Jessica's abrupt removal from the narrative left an anticlimactic gap. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no public reckoning, just a quiet retreat and the gradual unraveling of her influence. "It feels too easy," I admitted as we walked back toward the bookstore through the twilight-softened streets. "After everything she did, she just leaves?" "Not quite so simple from her perspective," Mr. Wilson pointed out. She's lost her inheritance, her reputation in financial circles, and her leverage with the development group. The settlement may protect her from prosecution, but it doesn't shield her from consequences. I considered this as we passed the harbor, its waters reflecting the first evening stars. The lighthouse beam swept across the bay in steady, predictable arcs, constant, despite changing tides and seasons. Like the bookstore, it oriented people, helped them find their way through darkness. "I suppose Grandma knew what she was doing," I conceded finally. "As usual." "Indeed." He paused at the corner where our paths would diverge. Maggie understood that some victories aren't about defeating enemies, but about creating something your adversaries can't diminish, regardless of their efforts. Back at the bookstore, I moved through the quiet rooms, straightening a chair here, aligning books, there preparing for tomorrow's customers. The day had been exhausting but fulfilling, a successful reopening followed by a decisive community endorsement, yet something still felt unfinished. In the back office, I opened the safe where I'd secured Grandma's journals and letters. The evidence of Jessica's actions remained organized in labeled folders, ready if ever needed, but no longer central to my daily thoughts. What drew me now was the small wooden box tucked behind them, the one I'd found in the playhouse alongside. The recovered first editions. Inside lay items Grandma had preserved specifically for me. Photographs of us together throughout the years, awards I'd won in school, the handwritten recipe for blueberry scones we'd baked every Sunday morning. Among them was a delicate silver locket on a fine chain, the one Grandma had worn daily for as long as I could remember. When opened, it revealed not the expected family photographs, but a tiny folded paper. With careful fingers, I extracted and unfolded it, revealing Grandma's distinctive handwriting. "For Emma," it read. "Remember that the purpose of weathering storms is not just to survive them, but to learn how they change the shoreline. Your new map will be more accurate than the old one. Love always, Grandma." The metaphor was so perfectly Maggie Collins, practical, insightful, and drawing on the coastal landscape she'd loved. The storms of betrayal and exile had indeed changed my internal shoreline, revealing bedrock I hadn't known was there, carving new channels for relationships, depositing unexpected gifts of resilience and clarity. I fastened the locket around my neck, the weight of it settling comfortably against my collarbone. Outside, night had fully descended, and the newly installed exterior lights illuminated the bookstore sign, casting a welcoming glow onto the sidewalk. From this angle, the building looked much as it had in Grandpa's photographs from opening day, the realization of a dream that had sustained not just a family, but a community. My phone chimed with incoming messages, congratulations from well-wishers, who'd attended the council meeting, inquiries about tomorrow's reading group, a reminder from Lily about ordering more Otter books. In each notification, I saw evidence of threads rewoven, connections restored. Yet one thread remained conspicuously absent from this tapestry of reconciliation. My mother had not returned my calls since the funeral, her silence a continuing wound despite the healing in other areas of my life. According to Aunt Sarah, she had retreated to Arizona immediately after the will reading, claiming the need to process everything, but effectively removing herself from the aftermath of Jessica's exposure. I hesitated, then composed a simple, "Art, the store reopened today. Grandma's legacy continues. You're welcome anytime." I added a photo of the restored reading nook where she had spent countless hours as a young mother, reading to me while Grandma managed the register. The response came faster than expected. It looks just as I remember. Give me time. Not the full reconciliation I might have hoped for, but an opening, a crack in the wall of estrangement that Jessica had so carefully constructed between us. Time was something I could give, now that the urgent battles had been won. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Through the glass, I recognized Mr. Cooper, the elderly man who had shared his anniversary tradition earlier. He held something in his hands, a book wrapped in faded gift paper. I unlocked the door, curious. "Mr. Cooper, did you forget something?" His weathered face creased in an apologetic smile. "No, dear. After our conversation today, I went home and found this. It's the last book your grandmother helped Helen pick out before she passed. We never got to finish reading it together." He extended the package toward me. I thought perhaps it could be the first volume in a special section. Books with unfinished stories, waiting for new readers. The unexpected gesture caught me off guard, emotion welling up as I accepted the offering. "That's a beautiful idea," I managed. "We could call it continued readings." His eyes brightened. Helen would have liked that. She always said the best stories never really end. They just wait for someone new to discover them. After he left, I stood in the center of the bookstore, cradling the wrapped book and absorbing the profound simplicity of his suggestion. Books, with unfinished journeys, passed from one reader to another, creating connections across time and absence. Wasn't that exactly what Grandma had done for me? Preserved her story until I could return to continue it. The next morning, I arrived early to create the new section. A small bookcase near the window became home to continued readings, with Mr. Cooper's book as its first offering. Beside it, I placed a leather-bound journal where future contributors could share the stories behind their donations. A young woman I didn't recognize was waiting when I unlocked the doors, shifting nervously from foot to foot on the sidewalk. "Can I help you?" I asked, holding the door open. "I hope so," she replied, following me inside. "I'm Claire Bennett. I've been looking for work since the cannery downsized, and Mrs. Henderson mentioned you might need help here." I studied. Her earnest expression, calloused hands that spoke of practical work, eyes that lit up as they scanned the bookshelves. "Do you like to read, Claire?" "It's gotten me through the hardest times," she answered with simple honesty. "Books have been friends when people weren't." The response could have come from my own heart at her age. I gestured toward the register. "Let me show you how the system works. We're implementing some changes, but the basics haven't changed since my grandmother ran things." As the morning progressed, Claire proved a quick study and a natural with customers. During a quiet moment, she paused before the continued readings display, reading the explanation I'd posted. "This is beautiful," she said softly, "connecting readers through shared books." "It was a customer's idea," I admitted, "but it feels right for this place." "Like your grandmother finding new ways to bring people together," Claire observed, straightening a stack of bookmarks on the nearby table. The insight startled me with its accuracy. Even now, Grandma was orchestrating connections. Through the store she'd preserved, through the truths she'd documented, through the legacy she'd entrusted to me. Each decision she'd made, from hiding the valuable books to recording Jessica's, deceptions had been part of a larger narrative she was writing even as her own story ended. The realization brought a sense of completion that had eluded me since the funeral. Grandma hadn't just left me an inheritance. She'd invited me to continue a story we'd begun together decades ago. The characters might change, new chapters would unfold, but the essential thread remained unbroken. That evening, as I updated the store's ledger with the day's transactions, I added a new section titled Continued Readings. Below it, I recorded Mr. Cooper's donation and its significance. Then, after a moment's reflection, I wrote, "Margaret, Maggie Collins founded this store believing that books create bridges between people, ideas, and possibilities. When those bridges were threatened, she found ways to preserve them until they could be rebuilt. This journal continues her practice of recording not just what we sell but what we share, the stories that connect us across time and circumstance. May it grow with each passing year, documenting not just a business, but a living legacy. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept across the darkening bay, steady and true. Inside, surrounded by thousands of stories bound in paper and ink, I added a new page to the one that mattered most, the ongoing tale of a place where every story, including mine, had the chance to continue beyond what seemed like an ending. 6 months after the grand reopening of Collins' bookstore, autumn had transformed Bayview into a canvas of amber and crimson. Morning fog rolled off the harbor, wisping around the lighthouse and threading through the changing leaves. I stood at the large bay window of Grandma Maggie's house, my house now, watching the town come to life below. The transition from outsider to prodigal granddaughter to respected business owner had been smoother than I'd dared hope. The bookstore had not only survived but thrived, becoming once again the pulsing heart of the community. Our new initiatives, local author events, literacy partnerships with the schools, and the increasingly popular Continued Readings collection had attracted attention beyond Bayview's borders. Last week, a regional newspaper had featured us in their Preserving Small-Town Culture series. But the true measure of success wasn't in publicity or even in profit margins. It was in moments like yesterday, when a shy 12-year-old had finally found the courage to join our Young Writers Workshop, or last Tuesday, when Mr. Cooper brought in a plate of his late wife's famous apple tarts to share during our mystery book club meeting. It was in the gradually shifting relationship with my mother, who had returned from Arizona last month to tentatively reconnect with both me and her childhood home. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7, reminding me that despite the peacefulness of this moment, the day ahead would be busy. The store opened at 9, but I needed to arrive early to help Claire prepare for the first event in our Lighthouse Stories series, a collaboration with the local historical society to document and preserve the town's maritime heritage. My phone buzzed with a text from Claire. "Coffee machine acting up again. SOS." I smiled at her dramatics. The vintage Italian espresso maker we'd installed during the renovations was temperamental but beloved by our customers. Claire, despite her many talents, remained intimidated by its hissing and gurgling. As I drove down Lighthouse Hill toward the harbor, the streets were still quiet, most shops not yet open for the day. The bookstore stood out with its warm interior lights already glowing against the morning dimness. Through the window, I could see Claire arranging chairs in the reading area, her brow furrowed in concentration. "The beast defeated you again," I called out as I entered, hanging my coat on the antique rack beside the door. She looked up with exaggerated despair. It made sounds I've never heard before. I think it was cursing me in Italian. "Let me work my magic." I moved behind the coffee counter, examining the machine with practiced hands. You just need to be gentle with the pressure valve. Less force, more finesse. Within minutes, the espresso maker was functioning smoothly again, the rich aroma of freshly ground beans filling the air. Claire watched with grudging admiration as I prepared 2 lattes. "How are the arrangements for today coming along?" I asked, handing her a steaming cup. "Almost done." Mr. Nichols from the Historical Society dropped off the lighthouse keeper's logs early this morning. They're fascinating. All these detailed observations about weather patterns, shipwrecks, even local gossip disguised as official notes. Her enthusiasm was infectious. "And that author you invited? The one who wrote about New England maritime mysteries?" She called to confirm she's arriving on the noon ferry. I nodded, mentally reviewing the day's schedule. The event had generated considerable interest, particularly after we'd discovered records suggesting Bayview's lighthouse might have been involved in helping escaped slaves on the Underground Railroad, a piece of local history that had never been properly documented. "I was thinking," Claire continued, arranging vintage navigation charts for the display table, We should create a special section for local history. Not just the lighthouse stories, but everything. The founding families, the fishing industry evolution, even the town's architectural changes. People are hungry for connection to this place. That's an excellent idea, I agreed, touched by her investment in the store's mission. Claire had proven to be more than just an employee. She'd become a collaborator, bringing fresh perspectives, while respecting the traditions Grandma had established. The morning passed in a blur of preparation. By 11, the first curious visitors began arriving, browsing the maritime book display while waiting for the main event. Among them was my mother, Diana, who had been making increasingly frequent appearances at the store since her return to Bayview. Our relationship remained a work in progress, the weight of her silence during my exile still creating moments of tension. But watching her admire the store's transformation, occasionally offering quiet suggestions based on her own memories of working alongside Grandma, I sensed a mutual desire to rebuild what Jessica had tried to destroy. "You've done something remarkable here, Emma," she said, helping me arrange refreshments for the attendees. "Your grandmother would be proud." The words, simple as they were, eased something within me. I wish she could see it. Mom's expression softened. "In many ways, this is still her store. I see her in how you welcome people, in the little touches that make this more than just a place to buy books." Before I could respond, the bell above the door announced a new arrival. Mr. Wilson entered accompanied by an elegant woman I didn't recognize. Her silver hair was styled in a neat bob, and she carried herself with the poised confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Emma," Mr. Wilson called, making his way toward us. "Allow me to introduce Dr. Eleanor Hammond. She's an archival specialist from the State Historical Commission." "It's a pleasure to meet you," I said, extending my hand. "Are you here for the lighthouse presentation?" Dr. Hammond smiled warmly. "Partially, but I'm also here because Herbert mentioned your continued readings collection. It's an innovative approach to community archiving, and I'd like to discuss the possibility of documenting it as a model for other small towns." The unexpected professional interest in what had begun as a simple tribute to Mr. Cooper's wife caught me off guard. "It's really just a small project." "It's preservation of living history," she interrupted gently. "And in my experience, the most meaningful historical work often starts with these personal connections." Our conversation was cut short as more people arrived, filling the store with excited conversation. By noon, every chair was occupied, with additional visitors standing along the bookshelves. The maritime author's presentation captivated the audience, particularly when she connected broader historical patterns to specific entries in Bayview's lighthouse logs. Afterward, as people mingled and examined the displayed artifacts, Dr. Hammond approached me again. "I wonder if I might see the complete continued readings collection and documentation," she inquired. "Herbert mentioned you keep a journal recording the stories behind each donation." I led her to the special bookcase near the window where the collection had grown to nearly 30 volumes, each accompanied by a handwritten card explaining its significance to the previous owner. The leather-bound journal documenting these stories sat on a small reading stand beside them. As Dr. Hammond carefully examined the journal, her professional demeanor momentarily slipped, revealing genuine emotion. "This is extraordinary," she murmured. "Not just the preservation of books, but the preservation of relationships to literature, how reading shapes lives and connects generations." "It was actually a customer's idea," I explained, sharing Mr. Cooper's story. "It just resonated with what I believed the store should be." She looked up, studying me with newfound interest. "And what is that exactly?" The question made me pause, considering my answer carefully. "A keeper of stories, not just those printed on pages, but those lived by the people who gather here. My grandmother understood that a community needs spaces where its narrative can be collected and continued." Dr. Hammond nodded thoughtfully. The Commission has been developing a program to recognize and support what we call living heritage sites, places that actively preserve community culture through ongoing participation rather than static displays. She handed me a business card. I'd like to nominate Collins Bookstore for consideration in our pilot program. The rest of the afternoon passed in a happy haze. The event concluded successfully, with many attendees contributing their own family stories to our growing collection of lighthouse history. Claire managed the sales counter with cheerful efficiency, while I circulated among guests, absorbing their memories and suggestions. Even my mother stepped in to help, her natural gift for making people feel heard, drawing out recollections from some of Bayview's more reticent elders. By closing time, exhaustion mingled with satisfaction as Claire and I began the cleanup process. Mom had left earlier for a dinner engagement with old friends, promising to call the next day. Mr. Wilson had departed with Dr. Hammond, who'd expressed interest in seeing the town's other historical buildings. "Quite a day," Claire remarked, collecting abandoned coffee cups from between the bookshelves. "Did I hear correctly that the Historical Commission might give us some kind of recognition?" "Apparently," I replied, still processing the unexpected development. Dr. Hammond seemed particularly interested in the community archiving aspect of what we're doing. Claire's face lit up. "That's fantastic. It would bring more attention to Bayview, maybe even some tourism." She paused, suddenly, thoughtful. "You know, it's strange to think how different things might have been. If your grandmother hadn't been so careful, if she hadn't preserved the evidence against Jessica." The mention of my cousin's name no longer triggered the surge of anger it once had. In the months since her hasty departure from Bayview, Jessica had faded from local conversation, her schemes replaced by more constructive topics. According to Mr. Wilson, she had relocated to the West Coast, taking a corporate position far removed from the family business she'd once coveted. "Grandma always played the long game," I said, straightening books on the new releases table. "She understood that some battles aren't won through confrontation, but through preservation, keeping what matters safe until the right moment." After Claire left, I lingered in the quiet store, savoring the particular peace that came from being alone among books at day's end. The golden evening light slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. In these moments, I often felt Grandma's presence most strongly, as if her spirit had been woven into the very fabric of the building. My thoughts turned to Dr. Hammond's interest in our community archiving efforts. What had begun as an intuitive response to Mr. Cooper's gift had evolved into something more significant, a living repository of Bayview's collective memory. It aligned perfectly with what Grandma had tried to teach me about the bookstore's true purpose. As I prepared to lock up, a soft knock at the door interrupted my reverie. Through the glass, I saw Aunt Sarah, her arms laden with what appeared to be old photo albums. "I know you're closed," she said apologetically when I let her in. "But I found these while cleaning out my attic and thought they should come home to you." The albums, their covers faded and corners worn, contained photographs spanning decades of the bookstore's history. There were images of Grandma and Grandpa on opening day, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, author visits, and countless candid shots of community gatherings. Among them were several of me as a child, perched on a stool behind the counter, solemnly helping customers with their selections. "I'd forgotten about these," I murmured, tracing a finger over a particularly charming image of Grandma reading to a circle of cross-legged children. "Where did they come from?" "Your grandfather was the family photographer," Aunt Sarah explained, settling into one of the reading chairs. "He documented everything, especially events at the store. When he passed, Maggie asked me to keep these albums safe. I think she worried about them being lost or..." She hesitated. "Discarded," I finished for her, understanding immediately. Even before Jessica's manipulations began, Grandma had been quietly securing pieces of our family's history, anticipating potential threats to its preservation. "There's something else," Aunt Sarah added, reaching into her tote bag. "Something Maggie specifically asked me to give you when the time felt right." She withdrew a small wooden box, its lid carved with intricate botanical designs. I recognized it immediately as Grandpa's handiwork. He had created similar pieces for special occasions throughout his life. "What is it?" I asked, accepting the box with careful hands. "Open it and see." Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay a delicate silver key unlike any I'd seen before. Its design was old-fashioned, with an ornate bow and complicated teeth. Beneath it was a folded note in Grandma's handwriting. "For Emma. The final piece comes home when you're ready to see the whole picture. The east wall holds more than books. Love always, Grandma." I looked up at Aunt Sarah, confusion evident in my expression. "The east wall? What does that mean?" Her eyes twinkled with shared secrecy. "The hidden cabinet, of course. Didn't you ever wonder why that section of shelving in the history alcove doesn't quite align with the rest?" In fact, I hadn't noticed. Not as a child when the store's quirks were simply accepted as normal, and not since returning when so many more pressing concerns had occupied my attention. But now, with the key cool against my palm and curiosity kindled, I moved toward the store's eastern wall where the local history section resided. The misalignment was subtle but unmistakable once pointed out, a section of shelving that protruded slightly further than those flanking it. I ran my hands along the wooden frame, feeling for any indication of a hidden mechanism. Near the bottom corner, my fingers detected a small, circular indentation, almost invisible to casual inspection. "It's there," Aunt Sarah confirmed, watching, with evident enjoyment. Herbert and I were the only ones who knew about it, besides Maggie. She made us promise not to mention it until you had fully settled back into the store. With trembling fingers, I inserted the silver key into the hidden keyhole. It turned with surprisingly smooth precision, and a soft click signaled the release of a locking mechanism. The entire shelving unit swung outward a few inches, revealing a shallow cabinet concealed behind the displayed books. Inside were several items arranged with Grandma's characteristic orderliness. A leather portfolio contained what appeared to be original architectural drawings for the bookstore building, dating back to the early 1900s when it had been converted from a ship chandlery. Beside it sat a metal strongbox, which opened to reveal a collection of rare coins and small gold bars, a substantial emergency fund concealed from Jessica's greedy scrutiny. Most intriguing, however, was a leather-bound journal similar to those Grandma used for inventory but older, its pages yellowed and cover cracked with age. Opening it carefully, I discovered it wasn't Grandma's handwriting that filled the pages, but an earlier hand, more formal, with flourishes characteristic of early 20th century penmanship. "That belonged to Abigail Collins," Aunt Sarah explained softly. "Your great-grandmother. She started the first lending library in Bayview long before the bookstore existed. Maggie always said the love of books and stories flowed in the Collins blood, passed down through generations." The journal detailed Abigail's efforts to bring literature to Bayview's residents during economically challenging times. She had begun by sharing her personal collection from her home near the lighthouse, eventually converting a small outbuilding into a proper lending library. Her entries revealed a woman deeply committed to the belief that stories could uplift and unite even the most divided community. One passage particularly caught my attention. "Today, Mr. Blackwell and Mr. Stevens, who have been feuding over property lines for a decade, sat side by side discussing Cooper's sea adventures without a hint of animosity. This is the true power of books. They create neutral territory where old conflicts lose their grip, if only temporarily. Perhaps in these shared moments of imagination, healing begins." The sentiment echoed so perfectly what I'd been trying to articulate to Dr. Hammond earlier that day. The Collins women had always understood the transformative potential of creating spaces where stories could be shared, where community could form around narrative. "There's more," Aunt Sarah said, pointing to a small envelope tucked into the back cover of Abigail's journal. Inside was a faded photograph of a woman standing proudly before a small clapboard building with Bayview Lending Library painted on its door. Her posture and determined expression immediately reminded me of Grandma Maggie, and, according to family comments over the years, of myself as well. "The Collins women have always been keepers of stories," Aunt Sarah remarked, as if reading my thoughts. "Maggie knew you would continue the tradition, even when others doubted." The discovery of this hidden history, this deeper legacy, settled over me like a mantle, both weighty with responsibility and comforting in its rightness. What I had thought began with Grandma and Grandpa in 1973 actually stretched back generations, connecting me to a lineage of women who understood the power of literature to shape and sustain community. Why didn't she tell me about this before? I wondered aloud, carefully returning Abigail's journal to its place in the cabinet. Aunt Sarah's expression turned thoughtful. "I think she wanted you to rediscover it on your own terms, to find your way back to the legacy without feeling obligated to it. Maggie always said true inheritance isn't what's given to you, but what you choose to claim." Later that evening, after securing the hidden cabinet and thanking Aunt Sarah for her revelations, I climbed the stairs to the apartment above the bookstore. Though I now lived in Grandma's house on Lighthouse Hill, I occasionally stayed overnight in this smaller space, especially after long days when the thought of driving home seemed too taxing. The apartment had been refreshed since my return. New paint, updated furniture, modern appliances. But its essential character remained unchanged. The bay window still offered the best view of the harbor, and the built-in bookshelves still housed the personal collection that had been too precious for the commercial space below. I prepared a simple dinner and settled at the small dining table with Abigail's journal, which I'd borrowed from the hidden cabinet for further exploration. Her accounts of early 20th century Bayview painted a vivid picture of a town navigating the transitions of industrialization while maintaining its maritime identity. Through economic hardships, 2 world wars, and social changes, the lending library had served as a constant, a place where community could gather to make sense of shifting times through shared stories. In a particularly poignant entry from 1918, Abigail described creating a memorial corner for local men lost in the Great War, filling it with books they had loved and photographs of their younger days. "We remember them not only as soldiers," she wrote, "but as readers, dreamers, and members of our story-sharing circle. In this way, they remain present among us." The parallel to our continued readings collection was striking. Both efforts recognized that books carried more than their printed content. They held the imprints of those who had turned their pages, found meaning in their words, been changed by their ideas. My phone chimed with a text from Mr. Wilson. "Dr. Hammond was quite impressed. Expects to have preliminary paperwork for the heritage site designation within the month. Well done, Emma." The validation from an outside expert was gratifying, but it paled in comparison to the deeper affirmation I'd received today. The knowledge that in restoring the bookstore, I hadn't just preserved Grandma's legacy, but continued a tradition stretching back generations. The Collins women had always found ways to anchor their community through literature, adapting their methods to changing times while maintaining the essential mission. As twilight deepened into night, I moved to the bay window with a cup of tea, watching the lighthouse beams sweep across the darkened harbor. From this vantage point, I could just make out the silhouette of Grandma's house, my house, on the hill below the lighthouse. The continuity of it all felt suddenly powerfully present. The generations of Collins women watching this same view, thinking about books and community, and how to preserve what mattered most. My phone rang, disrupting the moment of reflection. The number wasn't one I recognized, but the area code belonged to Arizona. Curious, I answered. "Emma, it's Jessica." The sound of my cousin's voice after so many months of silence sent a jolt through me. I hadn't expected to hear from her again. Certainly not directly. According to the settlement agreement, any necessary communication was supposed to flow through our respective attorneys. Jessica, I replied neutrally, unsure of her intentions. This is unexpected. I know, she said, an unfamiliar hesitancy in her tone. I'm probably the last person you want to hear from. What do you want? The question came out more sharply than I'd intended, old defensiveness rising despite my best efforts to remain calm. There was a pause, then a soft exhale. I'm not calling to cause problems or reopen old wounds. I saw the article about the bookstore in that regional magazine. The journalist mentioned the continued readings collection and the community archiving work. I remained silent, waiting for her to continue, still wary of her motives. It sounded like something Grandma would have loved, Jessica added, her voice softening. She always said books were living things that gained meaning from who read them. The accurate recollection of Grandma's philosophy caught me off guard. It was easy to paint Jessica as a one-dimensional villain who had never truly known or appreciated Grandma. But reality was more complex. She had spent time with Grandma. Two had worked in the bookstore before her ambition and jealousy twisted her perspective. Yes, she did say that, I acknowledged cautiously. I have something that belongs to the store, Jessica continued. A book Grandma special ordered for me when I was 14, a first edition of that mystery series I was obsessed with. I took it when I left Bayview, along with, well, other things I shouldn't have taken. Her voice faltered momentarily. I'd like to return it, maybe for the continued readings collection. I've written a note explaining what it meant to me back then. The request, so unexpected and strangely vulnerable, left me momentarily speechless. Was this a genuine gesture of reconciliation, or another manipulation? The Jessica I thought I knew would never volunteer to return anything she'd taken, would never admit to wrongdoing without legal pressure. Why? I asked finally. After everything that happened, why reach out now? There was a long pause before she answered. Because I've had a lot of time to think about what I lost. Not the inheritance or the property, but the chance to be part of something meaningful. You and Grandma understood what the bookstore really was. I only saw it as an asset to be maximized. Her voice grew quieter. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Emma. I know I don't deserve that. I just thought maybe the book should come home even if I can't. The sincerity in her voice seemed genuine, though years of her deceptions made me hesitant to trust my judgment where Jessica was concerned. Still, the idea of completing the circle, of adding this particular volume to our collection of stories, held a certain poetic justice. You can send it to the store, I said finally. I can't promise what will happen after that, but I'll receive it. Thank you, she replied, relief evident in her tone. And Emma? What you've done with the place. It's what it always should have been. Grandma was right about you. After the call ended, I remained by the window, watching the lighthouse, beam trace its predictable path across the bay. Jessica's unexpected outreach had unsettled the neat narrative I'd constructed about our family's recent history. I'd cast her as the irredeemable antagonist, myself as the vindicated hero, with Grandma as the wise orchestrator of justice. But real life rarely conformed to such clean storytelling. Was redemption possible for someone who had caused so much harm? Could a single gesture of returning what was wrongfully taken begin to balance the scales? I didn't have answers yet, but I found myself open to the possibility that Jessica's story, like all stories, might contain unexpected turns. The next morning, I opened Colin's bookstore precisely at 9 o'clock, the routine now comfortably familiar. Claire arrived shortly after, bringing fresh pastries from the bakery down the street and eager to discuss ideas for expanding our local history section following yesterday's successful event. As we worked side by side, preparing for the day's customers, I found myself seeing the store through new eyes, not just as Grandma Maggie's legacy entrusted to me, but as a living continuation of Abigail Collins's vision, and perhaps someday, a foundation for future generations to build upon. The bell above the door chimed as our first customer entered, Mr. Cooper, right on schedule for his Tuesday morning visit. He carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Good morning, ladies," he greeted cheerfully. "I found another book for your special collection. My brother sent it from Florida. It was Helen's favorite gardening guide. She'd marked all the plants she wanted to try growing." His eyes crinkled with fond remembrance. Never did get around to most of them, but she loved planning the possibilities. As I accepted his offering with appropriate reverence, adding it to the growing continued readings shelf with its accompanying story card, I felt the threads of community and continuity strengthen. Each book added was another connection preserved, another story acknowledged as worthy of remembering. By mid-morning, the store had filled with its usual diverse crowd, retirees browsing the new releases, mothers with young children gathered in the reading corner, high school students claiming the study tables by the windows. Dr. Hammond had returned as well, this time with a photographer to document various aspects of the store for the Heritage Site application. "We're particularly interested in capturing the interactive elements," she explained, watching as a young girl carefully added her name to the lending card of a book from the children's exchange shelf. "The ways you've created participation rather than passive consumption." As she spoke, my phone chimed with a notification from the delivery service. A package had arrived from Arizona, sent overnight express. Jessica had wasted no time in making good on her promise. "Would you excuse me for a moment?" I asked Dr. Hammond, who nodded understandingly. In the back office, I opened the carefully wrapped package to find a pristine first edition of the mystery novel Jessica had mentioned, along with a sealed envelope. The book itself was in excellent condition, its dust jacket protected by a clear cover, spine uncreaked despite its age. Jessica had valued it enough to care for it properly throughout the years, whatever her other failings. The note inside. The envelope was handwritten on simple stationery. "This book belongs with the Collins bookstore collection. Grandma Maggie special ordered it for my 14th birthday after I became obsessed with mysteries. I remember her saying, 'Jessica, you have the mind for puzzles and patterns. You just need to make sure you're solving the right ones.' I didn't understand what she meant then. Perhaps I'm only beginning to now. I've written the story of what this book meant to me on the enclosed card for your collection. Whether you choose to include it is entirely your decision, and I'll respect whatever you decide. Jessica." The accompanying card for the continued readings collection recounted how this book had inspired Jessica's early interest in business strategies and problem solving, how Grandma had encouraged her analytical mind while gently trying to direct it toward more constructive applications. The final line acknowledged how she had ultimately betrayed that guidance, solving the wrong puzzles for the wrong reasons. I sat with the book in my hands, weighing more than its physical presence, considering the complexity of family, the possibility of change, the power of stories to both divide and potentially heal. Jessica had taken so much, caused such pain. A single returned book with an acknowledgement of wrongdoing couldn't erase that history. And yet, wasn't the entire premise of the continued readings collection that books carried stories beyond their printed pages? That they gained meaning from the hands that held them, the lives they touched? This volume, with its complicated provenance, told a story as authentic as any other in our collection, perhaps more so for its honest reckoning with mistakes made. After careful consideration, I placed the book on the shelf with the others, its story card tucked inside the front cover. Not as absolution for Jessica, but as recognition that even painful chapters belonged in our collective narrative. Grandma Maggie had understood this when she preserved evidence of Jessica's wrongdoing alongside treasured family photographs, when she created consequences while leaving room for potential redemption. Returning to the main floor of the bookstore, I found Dr. Hammond examining the newly displayed architectural drawings of the building's evolution, which I'd framed after discovering them in Grandma's hidden cabinet. "These are remarkable," she commented. "They show how the space has been continuously adapted to serve the community's changing needs while maintaining its essential character." "That's been the Collins approach for generations," I replied, the truth of the statement settling deep within me. Preserving what matters while evolving with the times. As afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing above browsing customers, I felt a profound sense of continuity, not just with Grandma Maggie, but with great-grandmother Abigail, and perhaps with Collins women yet to come. The bookstore had weathered Jessica's attempts to transform it into something else, just as it had survived economic downturns, changing reading habits, and the digital revolution. Its resilience came not from rigidity, but from adaptation, not from excluding the difficult parts of its story, but from incorporating them into a larger, more complex narrative. Like the lighthouse on the hill, it stood as a beacon precisely because it acknowledged the existence of storms and the possibility of being lost. I moved through the familiar space, straightening books here, greeting customers there, watching new stories unfold within these walls that had witnessed so many before. The inheritance Grandma had fought to preserve for me wasn't just a building or a business. It was this living tradition of creating space for stories to be shared, for community to form around narrative, for the past to converse with the present while making room for the future. Outside, Bayview continued its daily rhythms, the lighthouse standing sentinel above the harbor just as it had for generations. Inside, Collins' bookstore hummed with the quiet energy of lives connecting through stories, exactly as Grandma Maggie had intended, exactly as it should be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.